Well, the Boston Globe's Kevin Cullen is now serving a 3-month unpaid suspension after an outside review found factual errors with columns and public appearances following the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. The outcome might not satisfy Cullen's sharpest critics, including WEEI's Kirk and Callahan, whose reporting forced the review. Then again, it doesn't make Cullen or the paper look particularly good. Adam has more.
As former AP editor Kathleen Carroll and ex-Miami Herald editor Tom Fiedler noted in their report, Kevin Cullen's first column after the marathon bombing contained an error. He said 8-year-old Martin Richard was killed after hugging his father, Bill Richard, who just finished the race, something Cullen also told the BBC.
Bill Richards ran the race today, and when he finished the race, his young son left the sidewalk. He went out into Boylston Street and hugged his dad.
In fact, Bill Richard hadn't run the race. The review said that error was discovered the next day, but went uncorrected for 5 years. In the same BBC interview, Cullen also described my friend, a firefighter named Sean, searching for the leg Bill Richard's daughter lost in the blast.
He told me he crawled on his legs, his hands and his knees, trying to find her leg, and he couldn't find it.
But according to the review, that never happened. In fact, Sean O'Brien first met Cullen the night after the bombing, which is one reason Fiedler and Carroll concluded this story, told by Cullen 4 months after the attack, was a complete fabrication.
Hey, Sean, it's Kevin. Yeah, I know. Why don't you come on? I'll come down and have a drink with me and Joe. And I don't even know what I'm talking to him about. He goes, no, I don't want to come out. I don't want to come out. Okay, well, listen, I'll see you later. And I said to Joe, I said, was Sean at the scene? And he said, he goes, Sean found the kid. And that's when I found out that the boy had died.
Still, the inquiry cleared Cullen of falsely placing himself at the scene of the attack, saying he didn't intentionally mislead, but used literary devices that created ambiguity. In a statement, Globe publisher John Henry and editor Brian McGrory said Cullen damaged his credibility but did not commit irrevocable damage, and that when his suspension is done, he'll spend 2 months reporting before returning to his columnist duties.
So I'm sort of interested in everybody's take on the two reports, the one done by Fiedler and Carroll, which was specific to the Boston Marathon, and then the one done by his peers, which was much more general, looked at 100 columns and then some others. What was your take on those two? And then did the punishment fit the crime? Adam, I'm going to start with you because you were digging into it
Can I
today.
answer part of your question?
Yeah.
You're answering directly. The report done by Fiedler and Carroll basically said Kevin Cullen writes by putting himself in the middle of the story, even if he wasn't in the middle of the story. That's a literary device he uses. That's why people might have thought he was suggesting he was at the site of the bombings. There was no intent to mislead, no evidence that he wanted to mislead. Here's why I have a hard time with that. The report also concluded that that anecdote that we saw, that tale of talking to Sean O'Brien, trying to get him out of the house, was a fabrication. To me, if you are saying this columnist fabricated in other areas, that is reason to think that maybe there was intent to deceive in the 2 columns where he suggested he was at the scene of the blasts. So I felt like they went a little light on him there. I also felt like the Globe's internal review that spot-checked a bunch of different column pieces, reading that after reading the Carroll and Fiedler review, totally different level of rigor. Yeah. I would not have wanted to be a former, or I should say a current colleague of Kevin Cullen's tasked with investigating him. It seems to me like both those reviews should have been external.
You know, there was a mention in the Fiedler report that I think Mark Morrow, one of Cullen's editors, said that people not familiar with Cullen's style might not realize that he wasn't actually claiming that he was there. You know, I'm as familiar with Kevin Cullen's style as anybody. I thought he was there. I certainly didn't remember that he wasn't there. How can I remember that? So I thought that was troubling. I agree that Cullen may not have deliberately done that, but it was troubling. I think that the big takeaway for me is we all have to remember that we're always on. We're always on. And that the column is one thing, but radio interviews you give, speaking appearances that you give are just as important to our credibility as the columns that we write. And some of the interviews and the speaking appearance were, you know, fairly devastating. Yeah. You asked if the punishment fits the crime. I don't know. I would just say he's been given an opportunity to reestablish a level of trust with his readers. I think it's going to be tough, but I hope he can do it.
I don't know either, frankly. I didn't question whether he was there or not. And I'm trying to remember my first take, and I probably just assumed he was there.
You did, yeah.
I am also familiar with Kevin's style, so if I thought later he probably wasn't there, that wouldn't have bothered me either in that way, because that's a style, so I wouldn't have thought anything about it. For me, it's the same thing with Adam. The completely fabricated piece, repeated over and over, is really distressing. And it like hurt me to watch him in that clip do that. Because at some point, I would have hoped that he would say to himself, no, wait a minute. You know, if it had been, even if it had been a more, and I'm trying to search now for something, more ambiguous telling of that, I can maybe have understood. But that was whole cloth made up, period. And I don't know how to assess that. I do agree with Adam. It should both have been external, absolutely. That puts everybody in a weird position. And here I am. And I know I'm going to probably get mail from people saying, you're so soft. You know, and I just don't know, you know.
Well, my takeaway is it's a debacle for the Globe on many different levels. First of all, their best columnist is going to be out of the paper for at least 6 months. That's a potential loss of readership that the paper can ill afford at this time. Second thing that jumped out at me is 5 years later, you still haven't corrected an error in a column that the reporter phoned in the correction on later that night. What's that all about? And then there's the question of the Globe's policies, its ethical standards. I'm still not clear on what those are. 15 years ago, Bob Ryan, the great sports columnist, was suspended for a month for saying in a TV interview that the wife of an NBA player should be smacked.
And by the way, Jerry Callahan said he shouldn't have been suspended for that.
Yeah, well, I guess a little bit of a double standard there. So he gets a month. Is what he did as bad or worse than Cullen? I don't know. I'm just saying it remains vague. And finally, one other thing. It's been notable to me that in the Globe's own coverage of this, or in some cases non-coverage, there's been no pushback on WEEI for their proven journalistic transgression here, which you noted right after it happened, the selective, distorted editing of the BBC interview to take out his disclaimer that he wasn't there.
Well, they haven't addressed the EEI thing at all, and I wondered about that. Did anybody think either of the reports should have addressed it? And the Globe itself didn't do any reporting on that.
What do you mean they haven't?
Well, the fact that they got, the degree to which they got the story going, they're really the reason this happened in the
I think that was noted. That was noted in the Mike Levinson piece, and it was noted in the Fiedler and Carroll review. And they actually
dismissed it.
One thing I don't think they did dismiss it. At one point, they actually said that Cullen dismissed the allegations against him as coming from, I don't remember what his characterization of EEI was, and Fiedler and Carroll, as I read it, did not seem comfortable. Their point was, if the criticism is valid, it doesn't matter what the source is. Well, they actually made that point explicit.
Well, the distorted editing of that tape was egregious.
This is the Crystal Campbell, when he
the
said...
BBC interview.
Right.
He says I wasn't
than what
there.
We just
no,
saw.
the Crystal Campbell thing.
The Crystal Campbell one, and then they took parts of it to prove that he's faking it.
Right.
I'm sure their failure to address that has nothing to do with the fact that John Henry and his Red Sox partners are business partners with WEEI to the tune of north of $150 million.
I don't think Kirk and
Sure, it has nothing to do with that.
I don't think they care. I don't think they care.